man, this is it. Okay, man, this is it. Ramps dropping. First wave, move out.
The sky is gray, heavy with smoke and salt. From the sea, the horizon trembles, an entire armada crawling closer through the mist. Battleships thunder, their guns vomiting flame toward a patch of black rock barely 8 square miles wide. Inside the tunnels beneath Mount Suribachi, Japanese officers stand motionless. The air tastes of dust and oil. They have spent months carving this underground fortress, a city of steel doors, command rooms, and suffocating silence. They had been told the Americans were weak, pampered soldiers of a materialistic nation, afraid to die for honor. Then, faintly, above the crash of artillery and the shriek of naval shells, another sound pierces the smoke. Bugles, dozens of them. Their notes echo across the beach, sharp, defiant, unwavering. The officers glance at one another. The Americans have landed. But this sound, this strange battle cry of brass and breath, carries a spirit they had not expected. In that instant, even before the first Marines reach the sand, the myth begins to crack. The island of Iwo Jima is about to become a furnace, where beliefs about courage, death, and spirit will be tested beyond imagination. By the winter of 1944, the Pacific War had become a grinding storm that left little doubt of its final direction. Japan's vast empire, once stretching from Manchuria to the jungles of Burma, across the Philippines and the islands of the Central Pacific, was collapsing island by island. The Americans, advancing through the ocean like an iron tide, had developed a methodical rhythm. Island hopping, bypassing strongholds, cutting supply lines, and strangling the empire's defenses from the sea and air. The capture of Saipan in July 1944 was the breaking point. For the first time, U.S. bombers could strike the Japanese home islands directly. The psychological blow was immense. Tokyo, once believed untouchable, now felt the thunder of American B-29s. For Japan's military leadership, the loss of Saipan was not only strategic, but spiritual. It shattered the illusion of divine invincibility. Admiral Toyoda Soemu, now Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, called it a blow to the very heart of the nation. Civilians in Japan were told to prepare for the decisive battle, APTE confrontation, that would determine whether the empire would endure or vanish. In the months that followed, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy fortified the remaining islands between the Marianas and Tokyo, among them a small, barely habitable island called Iwo Jima. On maps, Iwo Jima appeared insignificant, 750 miles south of Tokyo, an irregular mound of black volcanic ash, dominated by a single extinct volcano at its southern tip, Mount Suribachi. But in the eyes of the Japanese High Command, it was sacred ground. It was the Empire's forward shield, a radar and early warning station, and a guardian of the homeland itself. By 1945, Japan's leaders no longer hoped to stop the Americans. They hoped to make them bleed. The strategy was brutally simple. Inflict such appalling losses that Washington might negotiate peace rather than invade the home islands. To the soldiers and officers garrisoned there, Iwo Jima would not be defended. It would be consecrated. The defenders drew their strength from the Bushido Code, the ancient warrior ethic of loyalty, sacrifice, and death before dishonor. By this stage of the war, it had evolved into something darker, a national cult of self-destruction known as yokusai, the concept of shattering like a jewel. Better to die beautifully for the emperor than live in defeat. Within Japan's officer corps, this belief was absolute. The enemy, particularly the Americans, was seen as spiritually hollow, Japanese military education had long described the West as technologically advanced, but morally weak, a civilization of comfort, not of courage. The Americans, they believed, could win battles with machines but not with the human spirit. That assumption would define how Japan prepared for Iwo Jima, and how disastrously they would misjudge what was coming. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, the United States was preparing for the final push toward Japan. The Navy's Fifth Fleet, under Admiral Raymond Spruance, and the Marines under Lieutenant General Holland Howlin' Mad Smith were now seasoned by years of amphibious warfare. From Tarawa to Saipan, they had learned the terrible cost of attacking islands fortified to the last man, and the grim arithmetic that each step closer to Japan grew bloodier than the last. When planners examined Iwo Jima, they saw a necessary evil. The island's airfields could serve as emergency landing, strips for crippled bombers. Returning from raids on Tokyo, it could also provide fighter escorts for the massive B-29, formations hammering Japan's cities. The strategic logic was clear. Take Iwo Jima, and the Americans could tighten the noose around Japan's heartland. But no one, not even the Marines who had stormed Tarawa's beaches, could fully grasp what awaited them beneath that black sand. For deep underground, invisible to the aerial photos and naval bombardments, an entire army was waiting in silence. And at its center was a general unlike any the Marines had faced before. When Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi arrived on Iwo Jima in June 1944, he found a wasteland. The island was barely 8 square miles. Barren rock, sulfur vents, and fine volcanic ash that swallowed every footprint. There was no natural water, almost no vegetation, and the stench of sulfur rose constantly from the earth. Yet this hostile terrain would soon become one of the most formidable fortresses in modern history. Kuribayashi was no ordinary commander. A graduate of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy and a former military attaché in Washington, D.C., he had studied the United States firsthand. He had dined with American officers, toured their factories, and seen the country's immense industrial power. He understood something his superiors often ignored. Japan could not match America's material might. If Japan were to survive, it had to outfight the enemy in spirit, not in numbers, but unlike the fanaticism of other imperial commanders. Kuribayashi's vision of spirit was rooted in discipline and intelligent resistance. He forbade suicidal banzai charges, the glorious but futile waves of infantry that had slaughtered tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers across the Pacific. Instead, he ordered a defensive system that would turn Iwo Jima into a labyrinth of death. Under his command, 21,000 soldiers, including elements of the 109th Division, the 2nd Mixed Brigade, and naval personnel, began digging. They carved tunnels, bunkers, and firing chambers into the rock, connecting them through miles of underground passages. Every artillery gun, mortar, and machine gun was concealed. Every approach was pre-sighted for overlapping fire. Above ground, the island appeared almost deserted, a deliberate illusion. The Americans would bomb and shell endlessly, but the real defenders would be deep underground, waiting. By February 1945, the island bristled with over 700 fortified points, 13,000 yards of tunnels, and countless hidden pillboxes. Kuribayashi's plan was clear. Make the Marines pay for every yard. No counterattacks, no waste of lives, only relentless defense until the last man. From Tokyo, his superiors demanded that he die gloriously. Kuribayashi, quietly, prepared to die usefully. Across the Pacific, the American buildup for the operation, codenamed Detachment, was underway. It was the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War to date. 3 Marine divisions of the 5th Amphibious Corps, 4th, 5th, and 3rd Marine Divisions, supported by over 800 warships and 70,000 Marines, backed by days of continuous naval bombardment, a storm of fire meant to crush all resistance before the first landing. Commanders believed the island could be taken within a week. Intelligence estimated the garrison at 12,000 men. The bombardment alone was expected to annihilate most of them. Few realized that not a single Japanese position would be destroyed. For 3 days in mid-February, American battleships and cruisers pounded Iwo Jima with thousands of shells. The island trembled. Smoke rose like a black fog. Yet beneath the surface, Kuribayashi's men waited. In the tunnels, they endured deafening noise, choking fumes, and collapsing ceilings. They patched air vents, repaired wires, and held their breath. They would not fire a single shot until the Marines were on the beach. To Kuribayashi, this patience was the highest form of warrior discipline, a new kind of spiritual endurance. To his officers, it was a test of faith. Some still muttered that Americans had no tamashi, no warrior soul, that once they met real resistance, they would break and beg for life. On the morning of February 19, 1945, the illusion was about to end. The bombardment ceased. The sea fell eerily quiet. From the horizon, thousands of landing craft began to crawl toward the black shore. Inside them, Marines crouched low, faces set, rifles clutched, as ash and smoke filled the air. At 09:00, the first wave hit the beach. The sand was soft and deep, impossible to dig, impossible to run. Vehicles bogged down immediately. The noise of engines and shouted commands filled the air, and still, silence from the island. The Japanese did not fire, only when the beaches were crowded, when the Marines had no cover and nowhere to retreat. Did Kuribayashi give the order? At 10 a.m., Churditi Portstan, Utintitai did Utananti. The volcano erupted, not from nature, but from man. Mortars, artillery, and machine guns exploded all at once, cutting through the beach in sheets of fire. The Americans were trapped in open ground, the sea behind them, death in front of them. In the tunnels, the Japanese officers nodded grimly. At last, they would test the spirit of the American soldier. And yet, within hours, that test would begin to turn both ways. For decades before the war, Japan's military schools taught a simple truth. Spirit outweighed machinery. Victory, they said, came not from weapons, but from the purity of resolve. The samurai code, Bushido, had been revived into a modern religion of loyalty and sacrifice. From Manchuria to the Philippines, Japanese officers had seen Westerners surrender, weep, and plead for mercy. To them, it confirmed the stereotype that Americans lacked the inner steel to face death. Even on Iwo Jima, as naval shells shook the island, junior officers repeated it among themselves. The Americans feared death. They fight for wages, not for soul. But General Kuribayashi was less certain. He had seen the American soldier up close, courteous, disciplined, practical. He warned his men, "Do not underestimate them. They will not stop." Still, the mindset persisted. When the invasion began, many expected that the Americans would panic under fire. But the first Marines to hit the beach, young men from Iowa, Oregon, and Texas, didn't retreat. They crawled forward through volcanic ash that swallowed their boots. They dug foxholes with their hands. Their sergeants shouted orders through smoke and chaos, not to die for glory, but to take the next ridge. And the next. And the next. For the Japanese officers watching through periscopes and rangefinders, it was the first crack in a long-held belief. By 1945, the U.S. Marines were not the same force that had stormed Guadalcanal 3 years earlier. They were veterans of a brutal education. At Tarawa, they had lost over 1,000 men in 76 hours. At Saipan, entire battalions had been decimated in hand-to-hand combat. They had seen banzai charges, waves of screaming soldiers throwing themselves into death. They had learned that this enemy did not surrender, and that mercy was often met with a grenade. Iwo Jima was different. There would be no wild rushes, no sudden charges. Instead, the Marines faced something they could not see, an invisible enemy buried in the earth. Every rock could hide a machine gun. Every ridge could erupt with fire. And yet, they adapted. The battle became a test not of tactics, but of nerve. Marine engineers burned bunkers with flamethrowers, while riflemen advanced yard by yard. When officers fell, corporals took command. When radios failed, they used hand signals or simply shouted above the shell fire. There was no talk of surrender, only of surviving long enough to finish the job. War correspondent Robert Sherrod wrote, "It was not courage that kept them going, but habit. The habit of doing the impossible one more time. That endurance, quiet, mechanical, relentless, was something the Japanese had never accounted for. Iwo Jima was unlike any battlefield on Earth. Its black volcanic ash swallowed blood and rain alike. It offered no shelter, no firm footing. Tanks sank, men slipped, and shovels clanged against rock. Every breath carried dust and sulfur, every wound filled with grit. The Marines called it hell with the fire out. The Japanese, buried deep below, called it Chi no Shima, the island of blood. Mount Suribachi, at the island's southern tip, dominated everything. From its slopes, Japanese gunners could sweep the landing beaches with overlapping fields of fire. Further north, the terrain broke into jagged ridges and ravines, each carefully preceded by mortars and artillery. Kuribayashi's underground fortress turned the island into a living trap. Entire units vanished into tunnels. Snipers fired and disappeared. A machine gun might fire from one hole, then reappear 100 yards away, connected by invisible corridors. For the Americans, progress was measured in feet. Every cave cleared had to be burned, blasted, and sealed. Every night, the same pattern repeated. Advance by day, dig by night, fight again at dawn. The heat from explosions fused sand into glass. The wounded screamed for water. The living crawled over the dead. In the chaos, there was no front line, only a slow, grinding crawl toward a volcano that refused to yield. And yet, in that horror, something else began to surface. A respect that neither side had expected. The Japanese had sought to prove that spiritual strength could overcome material might. The Americans, through endurance, discipline, and sheer refusal to die, were proving something far more elemental. That the will to keep moving was its own kind of spirit. As the second day of battle dawned, Kuribayashi's men realized the Americans were not breaking. Instead, they were digging in, pressing forward, even under storms of fire. And then, through the roar of battle, came that sound again, the bugles. But before that moment, before those haunting notes echoed across the ash, both sides would face the first true test of what spirit really meant. Kuribayashi's defense plan defied everything the Marines had encountered before. In past battles, Japanese troops had met the enemy at the water's edge, launching suicidal counterattacks that collapsed under overwhelming American firepower. Kuribayashi saw that as waste. His doctrine was different. Kill 10 men before you die. His soldiers obeyed with precision. Machine guns were paired in crossfire. Mortars were hidden behind slopes, firing from invisible angles. Artillery was buried deep, with steel doors that opened only for seconds to fire. Every position was connected through tunnels, allowing a seamless withdrawal when discovered. The Marines quickly realized that traditional bombardments were useless. Naval shells flattened the surface, but the defenders below survived unscathed. Each advance required flamethrowers, satchel charges, and hand-to-hand combat. One Marine recalled, "You could take a pillbox, turn around, and the same gun would be firing from behind you. It was like fighting ghosts." The Japanese defense was a masterpiece of engineering and sacrifice, a fortress carved from hell itself. But Kuribayashi knew it was temporary. He had no illusions about victory. His goal was to make the Americans pay in blood, to turn Iwo Jima into a scar so deep that it would haunt their invasion plans for Japan itself. Yet in doing so, he forged something unintended: a mirror. For every Japanese soldier who fought with fanatical duty, an American Marine answered with cold persistence. Each tunnel collapsed, each ridge taken, became an exchange not of ideology, but of endurance, and endurance, as both sides would learn, was the truest form of spirit. The war in the Pacific was never just about land. It was a collision of beliefs, two moral systems meeting at the limit of human endurance. To the Japanese, death was a form of victory. The idea of surrender was not only shameful, it was unthinkable. Captured officers from earlier campaigns had been disgraced, their families shunned. Even in official training manuals, soldiers were instructed that living to be captured was worse than dying to the last man. To the Americans, survival was the mission. They fought not for a divine emperor, but for each other. The man beside them in the trench, the platoon, the promise of going home. They didn't seek death. They endured it. That difference created a quiet paradox. The Japanese saw themselves as spiritual warriors fighting a soulless machine. The Marines, through sheer persistence, revealed that the machine had a soul after all. Not mystical, but human. Day after day, under unrelenting fire, stretcher-bearers crawled across open sand to retrieve the wounded. Chaplains whispered prayers under bombardment. Flamethrower operators, knowing they would be targeted first, advanced anyway. These acts were not born from ritual or code, but from loyalty and love. Forms of courage the Japanese officers had never witnessed in the Western enemy. One captured Japanese diary, later found on the island, contained a single line: "The American spirit is stronger than we imagined." It was a quiet confession, the first acknowledgement that their view of the enemy had been incomplete. Among the strangest sounds on Iwo Jima were the bugles, American bugles, ringing through the smoke and ash. To the Japanese, bugles were instruments of ceremony and order, a call to charge, retreat, or die. But the Americans used them differently. In the chaos of battle, when radios were destroyed and visibility vanished in dust, Marine units used bugles and whistles to signal movement, a throwback to older wars. To the Japanese soldiers deep in their tunnels, the sound carried a haunting irony. Each note was a declaration. We are still here. We are still advancing. On the third day of battle, as the Marines clawed their way up the slopes of Suribachi, the bugles sounded through the smoke, dozens of them, overlapping, echoing across the black sand. Japanese officers listening underground froze. They had expected screams of fear, disarray, confusion. Instead, they heard rhythm. They heard unity. They heard will. For some, it was an insult. For others, it was terrifying. One lieutenant later wrote, "It was the sound of men who would not die when they should." The bugles became the Americans' unspoken language, not of pride, but of persistence. Each time the call pierced the haze, it reminded both sides that spirit was not the sole possession of one culture. It lived wherever men refused to yield. Kuribayashi himself, listening from his command post near the northern plateau, understood the message. He told an aide, "The enemy fights with the heart of a lion. We can only die as soldiers should." The clash at Iwo Jima had become more than a battle for terrain. It was a struggle for meaning, for the definition of courage itself, and soon that struggle would reach its breaking point as the Marines pushed toward the volcano and the Japanese unleashed their full fury from beneath it. In the days ahead, the island would become a graveyard, not just of bodies, but of illusions. The morning of February 19, 1945, began with deceptive calm. From the decks of battleships offshore, the black outline of Iwo Jima appeared still. silent beneath a haze of smoke and dust. The naval bombardment had ceased. Thousands of Marines crowded into their landing craft, engines roaring, salt spray in their faces, rifles clutched to their chests. At 09 Brown a.m., the first wave struck the beach. The volcanic sand, fine, soft and bottomless, swallowed boots and wheels alike. Men sank to their ankles. Amphibious tractors bogged down. Bulldozers spun helplessly. There were no craters for cover, only open ground stretching to a low embankment of ash. For a moment, it seemed the bombardment had worked. There was no enemy fire. Marines began moving equipment ashore, signaling others to follow. Then at precisely 10:00 a.m., the island came alive. From the ridges, slopes, and the base of Mount Suribachi, Japanese artillery and machine guns opened up all at once. A single, orchestrated eruption of steel. Shells screamed overhead, cutting through men and metal alike. Mortar rounds landed with deadly precision, tearing into the packed beach where thousands of Marines were trapped. One Marine later said, "It was like the gates of hell had opened. There was no front, no flank, just death everywhere." Within minutes, radio calls filled the airwaves with chaos. Landing craft were hit before they reached shore. Flames rose from wrecked vehicles. Wounded men lay scattered across the black sand, shouting for medics who could not reach them. The beach was too soft for tanks to maneuver, too exposed for retreat. Kuribayashi's strategy was working perfectly. From underground observation posts, his officers adjusted fire with cold precision. Machine gun crews rotated positions through tunnels, appearing and disappearing like phantoms. Every time an American tried to advance, a new burst of fire cut him down. By noon, the beachhead was a slaughterhouse. The 4th and 5th Marine Divisions had taken horrific losses, yet the line did not break. Small groups of men began to crawl forward, dragging flamethrowers, satchel charges, and explosives. They fought yard by yard, burning bunkers, sealing caves, clearing the invisible network that surrounded them. Every inch of Iwo Jima was mined, trapped, and defended. Even medics were targeted. Japanese snipers waited for them to kneel beside the wounded before firing. Still, the Marines kept moving. One correspondent described it simply: they did not charge. They endured. They advanced through hate itself. By the end of the first day, 30,000 Marines were ashore. Nearly 600 were already dead, thousands more wounded. Yet they held the beach. That night, the island burned. Tracer rounds arced across the darkness. The ground shuddered with the pounding of naval guns. The Marines dug shallow foxholes in the ash, unable to sleep, listening to the distant rumble of explosions and the screams carried by the wind. Inside the tunnels, Kuribayashi's men prepared for counterfire. They listened to the American bugles calling across the night, signals for movement, for stretcher-bearers, for regrouping. To many Japanese officers, the sound was unsettling. The Americans were not crying out in despair. They were reorganizing, calmly, methodically. When dawn came on February 20th, the Marines resumed the push toward Mount Suribachi. Progress was slow, measured in yards, not miles. Every ridge captured exposed the next layer of defenses. Flamethrower teams advanced under covering fire, their weapons belching streams of liquid fire into the tunnels. The air grew thick with burning fuel and sulfur. The Japanese fought back with a ferocity that defied comprehension. When positions were overrun, defenders detonated grenades against their chests. Wounded soldiers crawled from tunnels with explosives strapped to their bodies, sacrificing themselves among advancing Marines. For each pillbox destroyed, another came alive behind it. Kuribayashi's fortress was functioning exactly as designed, a machine of death that devoured both sides. By the third day, the Marines had reached the lower slopes of Suribachi. They were exhausted, filthy, and half-deaf from constant shell fire. Naval guns pounded the mountain, but the volcano stood firm, scarred yet unbroken. Smoke poured from its vents, mingling with the stench of blood and fuel. As platoons advanced up the slope, the defenders fired down from hidden caves. The Marines responded with flamethrowers and demolition charges. The temperature on the ground exceeded 120 degrees. It was here that the Japanese officers, deep within the mountain, began to hear the bugles again. At first faint, then clearer. Their sharp tones cut through the thunder of artillery, echoing off the volcanic walls. It was not music, it was signal. A call to advance, to hold, to live. For the men in the tunnels, it was impossible to ignore. They had been told that the Americans lacked spirit, that they feared death, that their will would crumble. But those bugles spoke another truth. The enemy was not breaking. He was adapting, learning, and surviving. One Japanese officer whispered to another, "These men fight like we do." Kuribayashi said nothing. He already knew the first major turning point was near. On the morning of February 23rd, a small group of Marines began climbing toward the summit of Mount Suribachi. They did not know it yet, but the world would soon see their struggle and the price of it, immortalized in a single moment that would outlive them all. February 23rd, 1945, Mount Suribachi, Iwo Jima. The air was thick with ash and smoke. The volcano's slopes were slick with loose rock and blood. Every few minutes, bursts of machine gun fire echoed from hidden caves, answered by the hiss of flamethrowers and the thunder of grenades. The Marines climbing the mountain were not part of some grand assault. They were a small patrol from the 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, 40 men chosen to test whether Suribachi's summit could be secured. At their head was First Lieutenant Harold Schreier, moving carefully over the jagged terrain, rifle in hand, his men spread wide to avoid presenting a target. Below, the rest of Iwo Jima still burned. Naval shells tore into the northern ridges. Black smoke rose in slow, boiling plumes. From within the labyrinth of tunnels beneath the mountain, Japanese soldiers listened to the explosions drawing closer. They had held the volcano for 5 days, an eternity in this inferno. But now every entrance was collapsing. The air was choking. The ground trembled constantly from bombardment. Kuribayashi's orders were absolute. Fight to the last man. No surrender, no retreat. Even so, the men on Suribachi knew the end was near. As Schreier's patrol climbed higher, resistance thinned. Most defenders had withdrawn deeper into the tunnels, waiting for nightfall to launch a final counterattack. The Americans moved cautiously, stepping over bodies, passing shattered caves still smoldering from flamethrowers. At 10:20 a.m., they reached the rim of the crater. The summit, a bleak, wind-whipped expanse of rock, offered the first clear view of the entire island. Below them stretched the black beaches, the endless lines of ships offshore, and the crawling masses of men still fighting across the central plain. Sergeant Ernest Thomas carried with him a small American flag taken from a transport ship. They fastened it to a length of steel pipe scavenged from the wreckage and drove it into the volcanic rock. As the flag rose, a ripple went through the battlefield below. From the beaches to the ships offshore, thousands of Marines lifted their heads. Some cheered, others wept. The sound of horns and whistles echoed across the island. To the Japanese soldiers still fighting in the tunnels, it was a chilling sound. Not triumphal, but defiant. In the darkness beneath Suribachi, one officer wrote in his diary, "The enemy flag has been raised on our sacred mountain. Yet their spirit shows no arrogance, only resolve. They are no longer fighting for land. They are fighting for each other." A few hours later, a second, larger flag was sent up the slope to replace the first, one visible from the beaches and the fleet. Photographer Joe Rosenthal, standing on the mountain's edge, captured the moment the 6 Marines raised it together. In that instant, amid the chaos and blood of Iwo Jima, a single image was born, one that would outlive every man on that mountain. For the Marines who saw it firsthand, it did not feel like victory. The battle was far from over. The mountain was only one corner of hell. But to those below, the sight of that flag fluttering against the sulphurous sky became a lifeline. Proof that endurance could still mean something in a place built for death. In the Japanese command tunnels, news of the flag reached General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. An aide reported it quietly, expecting fury. But Kuribayashi said nothing for several moments. Then he nodded slowly. "So, they have taken the mountain," he murmured. "But they will not take our spirit." He ordered his men to continue fighting. Not from Suribachi, but from the northern strongholds. The battle would now shift into a war of attrition. Kuribayashi understood the reality. Iwo Jima could no longer be held, but it could still bleed the Americans. His goal was no longer victory, it was legacy. If Japan must lose, it would lose with such ferocity that the enemy would think twice before invading the home islands. For the next 3 weeks, Iwo Jima became a graveyard. Japanese troops fought from bunkers that collapsed upon them. They emerged at night in silent, suicidal charges, entire platoons advancing in eerie, wordless unison, bayonets fixed, faces pale beneath layers of ash. The Marines met them with machine gun fire, grenades, and sheer willpower. One survivor recalled, "You stopped thinking about tomorrow. You just kept breathing, kept loading, kept shooting. Every night was forever." By early March, the battlefield had become a moonscape. The Marines had taken Suribachi, but the northern ridges, the meat grinder, were worse. Kuribayashi's tunnels turned every advance into a massacre. American commanders realized that Iwo Jima was no longer a battle for territory. It was a war of endurance between two nations' definitions of honor. The Japanese fought to die well. The Americans fought to make sure their friends didn't die for nothing. In Tokyo, radio broadcasts described the glorious defense of Iwo. But the truth was already known to the Imperial staff. The island was lost. Kuribayashi's messages grew fewer, his transmissions shorter. On March 21st, his final note was sent. "Our comrades have fought bravely. The enemy is tenacious. I pray for Japan's future, and for the souls of my men." No one heard from him again. Days later, his body was found among the ruins of a last stand, still wearing his sidearm, still facing the direction of the sea. When the battle finally ended after 36 days, more than 26,000 American casualties had been recorded. Nearly 21,000 Japanese soldiers had died, most in their tunnels, refusing to surrender. The island that once seemed insignificant had consumed the lives of two nations, and in the smoke rising over the black sand, the myth that had fueled both sides, of weakness versus spirit, of honor versus survival, was shattered. The men who fought there learned something raw, unspoken, and eternal. That courage does not belong to one flag, one race, or one code. It is born only in the moment between fear and duty, when a man decides to keep moving forward. When the guns finally fell silent on Iwo Jima, there was no cheer, no victory parade, only the slow, rasping sound of the wind through the black sand and the faint crackle of burning wreckage. For the Marines who survived, the end was not a celebration. It was exhaustion. Many sat in silence, staring across the wasteland that had once been a volcanic fortress. Every inch of the island had been fought for. Every ridge, every tunnel, every bunker had been paid for with blood. By March 26, 1945, the island was officially declared secured. But it was a victory that came at a terrible price. The U.S. Marine Corps suffered over 26,000 casualties, including nearly 7,000 dead, more than any previous battle in Marine history. For every square mile gained, Hundreds of men had fallen. The Japanese garrison, nearly 21,000 strong, was almost completely annihilated. Only 216 prisoners were taken alive. The rest either fought to the death or took their own lives after expending their ammunition. The island that once measured only 8 square miles had consumed the lives of tens of thousands. The air reeked of sulfur and death. In the days that followed, bulldozers dug mass graves, while chaplains recited prayers over rows of helmets lined along the shore. A Marine officer wrote in his diary, "We came here to take an island, but I think the island took something from all of us." Strategically, the victory was enormous. For the first time, American bombers had a base within 700 miles of Tokyo. The airfields carved from Iwo Jima's volcanic rock would become vital for the B-29 superfortresses, returning from raids over Japan. In the months that followed, more than 2,400 damaged bombers made emergency landings on Iwo Jima's runways, each carrying 10 or more men, whose lives were saved because Marines had taken that ground. Thousands of airmen survived, who would otherwise have been lost at sea. But the men who fought there rarely spoke of strategy. For them, Iwo Jima was not a stepping stone. It was a scar, a place where the idea of war itself changed. The Japanese High Command had miscalculated the American spirit. Before Iwo Jima, many Imperial officers still believed that Americans, soft, individualistic, materialistic, would break under prolonged casualties. They assumed that spiritual strength alone could overcome industrial power. But Iwo Jima proved otherwise. It showed that America's strength was not only in its machines, but in its men. Men who would crawl through fire, sand, and darkness for one another. The bugles that had once mocked the Japanese belief in Western weakness now echoed as symbols of endurance. One surviving Japanese officer later admitted during interrogation, "We believed the Americans were weak because they feared death. We learned here that they feared it, and fought on anyway." It was a realization that carried through to the highest levels of Japanese command. When reports of Iwo Jima reached Tokyo, even the emperor was said to have been shaken by the scale of the loss. If this was what the Americans endured for one small island, what would they do for Japan itself? In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt received the casualty reports in silence. He was briefed that the next target, Okinawa, could be even worse. Iwo Jima had been meant as a preview, a glimpse of the resistance the United States would face if it invaded the Japanese home islands. Roosevelt, exhausted and ill, understood the implications. Each island closer to Japan demanded a higher price. Each mile gained was another 1,000 men gone. The victory on Iwo Jima was not a triumph of conquest. It was proof of endurance, proof that the road ahead would be darker still. In the ruins of the battlefield, U.S. burial teams worked day and night, collecting bodies from caves and ravines. Many Japanese soldiers were buried where they fell, their names never recorded. For the Marines, temporary cemeteries lined the beaches, endless rows of white crosses and stars of David under the shadow of Mount Suribachi. Above them, the flag still flew. It fluttered in the sulfur wind, the same one raised by 6 men on the volcano's summit. 3 of those men, Harlan Block, Franklin Sousley, and Michael Strank, were already dead by the time the battle ended. Their image, captured by Joe Rosenthal's camera, would circle the world. It became a symbol of American resolve, of sacrifice without words. But for those who were there, it was not an image of glory. It was a memory of pain, and of men who never came home. The final Japanese message intercepted on the island read, "Though our bodies fall, our hearts remain as one with Japan." It was found written on a scrap of paper inside a bunker, next to the remains of a lieutenant clutching a broken sword. Even in death, their devotion was absolute. Even in victory, the Americans could not hate them. A Marine chaplain summed it up best. They fought with courage, and so did we. But courage alone does not make a cause just. From the ash and ruin of Iwo Jima, both nations carried something forward. Japan, the tragedy of its code. America, the burden of its endurance. And as the wounded were shipped home and the ships turned north toward Okinawa, a quiet realization settled over every survivor. If this was the cost of one island, then the cost of ending the war entirely would be unimaginable. In the weeks following the capture of Iwo Jima, the island became more than a battlefield. It became a mirror, reflecting the two sides of human endurance at war's extreme. For Japan, Iwo Jima was both a tragedy and a revelation. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff received Kuribayashi's final reports in stunned silence. He had fulfilled his promise. His garrison had fought to the last, killing more Americans than any single Japanese division in the war. But the cost was absolute annihilation. Kuribayashi's strategy had proven brilliant, yet his outcome inevitable. No amount of courage, no mastery of defense, no sacrifice of life could stop the tide of American firepower and determination. The Bushido Code, once a source of invincible pride, had turned into a chain that led men to their deaths for a war already lost. In the months that followed, Japanese newspapers published sanitized accounts of glorious resistance, omitting the despair, the hunger, the silence that filled the tunnels in those final days. But among officers, a quiet doubt began to spread. If men like Kuribayashi, disciplined, brave, and brilliant, could not stop the Americans, then perhaps Japan's faith in moral superiority was misplaced. The old phrase, "The Americans are machines without spirit," was no longer spoken aloud. Because at Iwo Jima, the machines had shown something the Bushido Code could not explain. They had shown compassion, endurance, and unity under unbearable fire. For the United States, Iwo Jima became both a victory and a warning. The flag on Suribachi had given the nation hope, a symbol of triumph at a time when the Pacific still burned. But the casualty lists told another story. When the numbers reached Washington, military planners understood that the invasion of Japan would be catastrophic. If one small island could cost nearly 7,000 American lives, what would it take to conquer the home islands, where millions of soldiers and civilians were prepared to die rather than surrender? The calculations were grim. Projections for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, estimated 1 to 2 million Allied casualties and perhaps 10 million Japanese deaths. Iwo Jima had proven the courage of both sides, and revealed that courage alone could no longer justify the slaughter. That understanding, more than any single battle, influenced the decisions that followed. In the months ahead, as American bombers struck Tokyo and Okinawa turned into another nightmare, the shadow of Iwo Jima hung over every briefing. When the atomic bomb was finally tested in July 1945, some of those who had seen the black sands of Iwo whispered the same thought. If it spares another Iwo, perhaps it is mercy. In Japan, the myth of invincibility had died on that island. When Kuribayashi's name was mentioned, it was with reverence, but also sorrow. He had fought perfectly, obeyed completely, and died honorably. And yet, Japan still lost. His son, later interviewed after the war, said quietly, "My father taught us that dying bravely is not the same as winning wisely." It was a lesson that Japan would carry into its reconstruction. The idea that spirit alone, without compassion or foresight, could destroy what it sought to defend. For the Marines, Iwo Jima became a memory etched in silence. Many survivors never spoke of it. When asked, they would simply say, "You had to be there." They remembered the sound of the bugles, the strange, defiant notes cutting through the chaos. and the moment when they realized that the enemy they fought was not a monster, but a mirror. One veteran wrote years later, "We were told the Japanese had no heart, but when you saw them fight, you realized they had too much of it. Maybe that's why none of us came home the same." The image of the flag raising became part of American legend, immortalized in bronze at the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington. But the men who raised it were not thinking of glory. They were thinking of their fallen brothers, and of surviving one more day. The photograph became a symbol of victory, but also of burden, a frozen moment that carried the weight of every man who didn't return. Today, Iwo Jima remains sacred ground for both nations. Japanese families visit the island to honor ancestors who died there, leaving offerings in the caves and along the cliffs. American Marines return to stand before the black sands, to remember the cost of their flag. The two nations that once saw each other as soulless enemies now share a quiet reverence for that place. The volcano still smokes faintly, its soil still black and sharp underfoot. And if you stand there long enough, when the wind blows from the sea, you can almost hear it. The faint echo of distant bugles carrying across the surf. Not the sound of conquest, not the sound of pride, but the sound of endurance, of men who, in the darkest moment of war, discovered that the true measure of spirit is not in dying without fear, but in fighting on despite it. In the end, Iwo Jima was not a victory of one nation over another. It was a revelation of what men can endure when stripped of everything but duty. The Japanese went into the battle believing the Americans lacked spirit, that no industrial power could match the devotion of a soldier willing to die for his emperor. The Americans went in believing the Japanese were fanatics, incapable of fear or mercy. Both were wrong. On that island of ash and fire, they learned the same truth in opposite ways. The Japanese discovered that the enemy's strength was not only in steel and firepower, but in a quiet, relentless will. The will to endure, to protect, to keep moving forward, even when hope seemed lost. The Americans discovered that spirit was not owned by culture or creed. It lived even in those they fought, in the courage of men who faced certain death with unwavering calm. In those weeks of horror, the illusion of superiority, racial, moral, or spiritual, burned away. What remained was something older and deeper, the shared humanity of men at war. Long after the gunfire faded, the echoes of Iwo Jima lingered, not in speeches or parades, but in the memories of those who survived. They carried it in their eyes, in the silence between words, in the way they looked at the flag that flew over Mount Suribachi. It was not a symbol of triumph. It was a reminder of cost, and of the fragile line between courage and destruction. Iwo Jima remains a wound on the earth, but also a monument to endurance. To the men who fought there, on both sides, spirit was no longer an idea. It was something real, proven, and forever bound to that black volcanic soil. And when the wind blows over the island even today, the waves carry a faint echo, not of bugles calling to war, but of memory calling to peace.